Thanks very much, Rich. It's great to be here. It's a real honor to follow Stan Evans. Stan Evans is just one of the giants of the conservative movement, and I want to indicate that I'm going to discuss a little bit a point that Stan made a few minutes ago when he spoke about how the federal government spends $600 billion a year in poverty alleviation. Hayek wrote about that kind of stuff, and he called it kind of the knowledge problem. He said, government spends all this money and it doesn't really exactly know how it should spend the money. But the thing about Hayek is he was a very generous soul, and he didn't like to impugn people's motives. What Hayek was really kind of driving at is that the government doesn't want to solve poverty, it just wants to collect money to say it's solving poverty. The kind of stuff that James Buchanan would then follow up on. So I'm going to talk about some of those things in the tradition of F.A. Hayek. This week marks a grim anniversary in world affairs. It is the 75th anniversary of Hitler's takeover of Austria, the Anschluss, as it was known, of March 1938. Austria, beloved Austria, home and locus classicus of that savior of modern economics, the Austrian school. This very week, as we gather here to ponder the potential future of this great land of ours, the United States, we would do well to remember the gifts of Austria, in particular its favorite sons in modern economics, F.A. Hayek and Ludwig von Mises, to be sure, but also names that are perhaps not so familiar to us today, such as Hayek and Mises' indispensable teacher, Karl Menger. All three of these men, Hayek, Mises, and Menger, were justly appalled at the great calamitous events that shook their beloved Vienna in the early years of the 20th century, particularly World War I. They, of course, understood that their own state, Austria-Hungary, bore grave responsibility for starting the unnecessary Great War. And Menger, who was 74 when the war broke out in 1914, could do little but endure it. Hayek and Mises, however, were young men during the war, World War I, and it was that event which steeled both to commit themselves to careers not only in economics, but in political economy, such that the forces that compelled the big state-driven mistake that was World War I be drained out of human affairs. Our tendency today, since that time, is to think of World War II in its antecedents, the Nazi and the Soviet 1930s, as the thing that galvanized Hayek and Mises. And while it is true that these men, who were in the full bloom of their careers when that latter war hit, World War II, provided truly timeless analysis of that era, above all Hayek's Road to Serfdom of 1944, let it be clear that it was World War I that shaped these men when their minds were the impressionable ones of youth. The power that these men brought to their analysis of state socialism and communism in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s was that they had first developed as a response to World War I. Now, instead of going into a big history lesson, let me just remind all of you that World War I had nothing to do with ideology. There was no fascism, Nazism, socialism, communism, or anything like that as the European states went to fight in 1914. All there was big government. Governments in 1913 were not big in the conventional sense. They did not displace large percentages of GDP, a concept that governments themselves came up with in the 1930s to measure how big they had truly grown. Rather, in 1913, governments were big, perhaps the right word is overbearing, in two other ways. First, they commanded obedience to their authorities and whims, and second, they were busy building extra institutions that would enable the extension of the state in the future, at least the near future of the Great War. Thus, when the states declared war in 1914, these being Austria-Hungary, Germany, France, Russia, Italy, and Britain, they were able to impress upon their populations the need to go to war in the absence of a military draft, something which came to all these places anyway, as the war ground on. Young men signed up for the front, and manufacturers retooled to war production because the state wanted it. At the same time, something else was coming into its season in the sun: central banking. It remains one of the great buried secrets of contemporary history that central banking actually owes its origins to the need to underwrite government debt, and that in case of war. In the latter decades of the 19th century, national banks throughout Europe became central banks, in that the currency they managed became legal tender, Their roles as lenders of last resort became formalized. The state insinuated its ministers into positions of power in these banks, and their gold requirements became suspendable in times of crisis. From the perspective of history, it is clear that the military preparations that preceded World War I also included, as an adjunct, the means of funding government purchases in the absence of a real market. By the way, this is one of the killer points that Neil Ferguson makes in his book, The Pity of War. And it's a book that made a huge splash and then everyone forgot about it. And he pointed out with abundant detail and evidence that, yeah, central banking arose in Europe in the 1880s, 90s, and early 20th century because these states were planning on going on imperialistic war and needed to fund their deficits in order to do so. That's where we got central banking from. The complicity of the rise of central banking with the push for imperialist war on the part of the great European powers at the turn of the 20th century makes it all the more odd that the United States followed suit and established the Federal Reserve in 1913, now exactly 100 years ago. Central banking, as it was perversely developing in Europe in the years right before 1913, when the United States acted, was becoming more and more dedicated to the needs of the crisis-inducing state. Why would the United States, uninterested as it was in going down the sinkhole of war with the European powers, see to it to mimic the European powers at just that moment by creating a Federal Reserve? Now look, to be sure, there were domestic concerns. No one wanted to repeat the panic of 1907. Remember how bad that was? It wasn't that bad at all. That played a role in the creation of the Fed. But the evidence that soon unfolded indicated otherwise. Within just 3 years of the Fed's creation, the United States was in the war, World War I, and running budget deficits in the tens of billions of dollars. And all this was despite the institution of the income tax that same year, 1913, whose marginal rate in 1918 was all the way up to 77%. The United States, by the late teens, was producing debt for war far out of proportion to the country's ability to pay for it, and there was the Federal Reserve greasing the monetary skids, just had been the plan all along among the European belligerents. Now, the reason to go into all this detailed history is that this was the history that made F.A. Hayek in particular, and Ludwig von Mises, who was a little older, come alive. Hayek spent World War I on one of the Austrian fronts. He saw the command economy that accompanied the war, and he soon came to know, through dedicated study after the war, the financing means that had made it all available. The basic point that Hayek would come to conclude from his reflections on the Great War in the 1920s was a simple one. The state does things for its own purposes. If the state has a central bank, it is not to correct a flaw in the economy, but to supply the state with resources when the market is otherwise ill-disposed towards that purpose. If the state wants to take on all kinds of social services, it is not because there has been some kind of real market failure in this regard, but because civil associations that represent threats to the state with overweening aspirations must be stomped out. If the state collects statistics, this is done first and foremost to flatter the state. In all of this, we have, of course, an anticipation of public choice economics, that offshoot of the Austrian school, one of whose principal founders, James Buchanan, the Nobel Prize winner, died just a few months ago. Hayek's most famous article in the Canons of Economics is the 1945 piece he wrote called The Use of Knowledge in Society. This is where Hayek showed that it is impossible for any government or planner to make the gamut of major economic policy choices for a society, because there is no way that millions of individual interests could possibly be ascertained by a central authority. Hayek always sounded very generous in his writing, and he was very generous, but it becomes clear in this article, and from the contemporaneous Road to Serfdom, that Hayek knew all along that he did not wish to impute innocence to central planners. The knowledge problem was not some simple mistake on the part of the state, but a result, the veritable smoking gun of a state trying to seize inordinate power. The knowledge problem was not the unintended consequence of a well-meaning government, but rather a particularly easy way to expose the fraudulence of the Leviathan without outright questioning its motives. Ludwig von Mises ended up becoming very explicit about this towards the end of his life. In one of Mises's last published pieces of 1969, he reflected on the way the German School of Economics, which had done its best to justify the aims of the Kaiser's Germany and then Hitler's state, had made itself servile to the state, justifying state planning and so forth so as to get in good with the authorities. As Mises wrote, this is Mises' quotation from 1969, "The main and only concern of the Austrian economists has been with the advancement of economics." So what can all this deep background with Hayek and Mises possibly have to do with us today? The first thing we have to realize is that it was not the extremes of the 20th century that got the great Austrians, the great free marketeers and classical liberals, to run for the barricades. It wasn't World War II. It was World War I. So often today we comfort ourselves with the thought that certain big things are very clear and comforting. No matter how fanatic our big government appears to us today, it is, of course, a universe away from what Hitler and Stalin represented. Indeed, there is even an unwritten rule in polite conversation that we are not supposed to bring up Hitler's name in comparison to any contemporary event, and that the comparison must be invalid on account of Hitler's unique enormity. Surely the comfort we in the West and the United States have taken over the years in not being anything near Nazi Germany or communist Russia has led to a complacency, possibly at this point quite dangerous, in that we have permitted the state to march and march and march. Now that we know how big the state is as a percentage of GDP, it is pushing 40%. The state has the financial power of the nation, if not the world, at its knees in the form of the Federal Reserve. The regulatory apparatus knows no constitutional restraint, as shown most notoriously by John Roberts' sad acquiescence to Obamacare at the Supreme Court last summer. The tax system is bent on meeting the challenge of trillion-dollar deficits. And none of this is to mention the state's public education monopoly, the cashiering of the Second Amendment, and so on. The point to draw from Hayek and Mises is that these great Austrians did not need World War II to get them very alarmed. They were rallying full force on initially seeing the operations of an overweening state, namely when the major nations went to war in 1914. That was sufficient for this generation of Austrians represented by Hayek and Mises to have all their arguments and polemics worked out by the time the really untoward events would come forward, such as Bolshevism and then National Socialism. In other words, if today we want to be true to Hayek and the Austrians, we have to say that the time is now in the United States, as government is very big and getting bigger. Little of any comfort is to be taken from the extremes of the totalitarian regimes not being represented in our nation today. Rather, we have to concede that the present displacement of the private economy, of religion, of civil associations by Leviathan is at a very advanced state, one that meets or surpasses the healthy minimum of Leviathanness that got Hayek and Mises started in the work of being counteractive nearly a century ago. What is to be done? The one thing American conservatives have got to get straight is that economic growth is a very important American value. We need to get this country's economy in a race with its government. It is highly unlikely that if the United States grows at the rate it did in the 19th century, indeed in the 125 years before 1913 and all the big progressive reforms, that the state could possibly keep up with the real economy. Let's look at the numbers. Gross domestic product, GDP, the state's pet statistic, again conceived during the Great Depression by the government statistical agency as a sort of beauty mirror. The state wanted to see how much this GDP number could flatter its management of the economy. Yet time has shown that that most key metric, government as a percentage of GDP, can prove very useful in measuring the disutility that government brings to economic performance. Last year, in 2012, one of the classic books of modern conservatism marked the 25th anniversary of its publication. I speak of Robert Higgs's Crisis in Leviathan, Critical Episodes in the Growth of American Government, published in 1987. One of the key points Higgs made time and again in Crisis in Leviathan is that all the way through to the 1920s, government as a percentage of GDP in this country always reverted to the trend of 2 or 3% of GDP. There were crises that came about, to be sure, big ones too, from the Civil War to the Great War. But every time, after 1815, after 1865, and even after 1918, the federal government's share of overall output came back down to 1/30th or 1/40th. The big change happened in the 1930s, when that share leapt above 10%, from 2% to 10%, government share of GDP. After the explosion in federal spending that was World War II, peacetime spending brought another increase in the norm to 15%. From 2% throughout American history, then to 10% in the 1930s, and then to 15% in the 1950s. Stagflation in the 1970s gave us 20% federal expenditures to GDP. We trended a little below that mark in the 1980s and 90s, in the high teens, but here we are at present with something like a quarter of the economy gobbled up by government. Throw in state and local, and we are talking 35 to 40% of GDP in this one crude measurement of the extent of Leviathan. You see, that's kind of creeping. 125 years of history. The United States always stuck with 2% of GDP, federal displacement of the economy. There were big crises, bigger than the ones we have now, Civil War, and it always returned that way, all the way until the 1930s. Then it went to 10%, a five-fold increase, then to 15% in the 50s, then to 20% in the 70s, trended down a little bit, now it's powering forward to 25%. I just submit to you that Hayek and Mises would have been very clear on this if they had been young men while all this was going on. It's like, yeah, the Leviathan is getting dangerous. And you can see how they reacted to the rather minimal state of Austria-Hungary in 1914, so it was getting overbearing. We think it was communism and Bolshevism that got these guys going. No. It was a well-meaning state that got them going. If you apply Hayekian logic to this phenomenon, public choice logic, the answer to the question of why government got this big is because it could. The Industrial Revolution brought so much in terms of economic riches to this country that the government wanted more than its fair share. The solution is not necessarily to cut government, by the way, because this would be to focus on the numerator of the percentage of GDP statistic. Why do that? This would be government-centric. If you focus on cutting government, you're focusing on government. You're going to focus on the real economy. The focus must be on the denominator and the percentage of government as a proportion of real GDP. With an ever-increasing size of the U.S. economy, it would become impossible for the government to keep up. By relative, if not absolute terms, government would shrink, given real economic growth. Again, to use the state's own pet statistic, GDP in this country averaged a shade under 4% for the 125 years until the founding of the Federal Reserve and the income tax in 1913, 4% per year. Since that time, the economy has grown at a shade over 3% per year. The difference is about 0.7 of a percentage point per year over the last 100. By extrapolation, the American economy today would be twice as large as it is had the long pre-1913 trend of economic growth held up. Twice as large. We would be a $30 trillion economy today instead of a $15 trillion one, as we are. The ratio of government to GDP would be half of what it is today. And the total government debt, which today is $16 trillion, could be paid off right now without any diminishment in the living standards we currently enjoy. You see, that's what happens when economic growth is given even a little better. It becomes even a little better than it has been in the past. The exponential effect is so great that government would have to race far beyond its massive current extent even to keep up. Again, to make the point, if we had maintained this nation's standard rate of growth through 1913, a rate that had been maintained for a century and a quarter, our government would be only half as large as it is today in comparative terms, and there would be no national debt. A government that is 12% of GDP, which it would be if we had our current size government, but we had a $30 trillion economy, sounds like pie in the sky, right? Yet this was roughly the profile of the federal government and the economy at the tail end of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's domestic policies in the New Deal, which was big government. Now you may say, the very reason that the economy did not grow at the old historic rate is that government got so large. And of course this is true. There has been one major inflection point in all of American economic history, all 224 years of it since the ratification of the Constitution. This was 1913. Before that date, 1913, 100 years ago, growth was steady at 4% with few recessions, as we call them today. After 1913, growth was nearly a point lower, and there were massive variances in economic performance, major depressions and episodes of price inflation, such had never been seen on extended scale in the 19th century. The efficient reason for this change in 1913 was that in that year, the government gave itself the tools of monetary and fiscal policy in the form of the Federal Reserve and the income tax. Of course, these institutions are at the root of the post-1913 underperformance. You can say that monetary and fiscal policy was pursued ineptly, but again, in the Hayek-James Buchanan view, the state usually does pursue what it wants. The century and a quarter leading up to 1913, that period which gave us the Industrial Revolution, proved that the private sector, if left largely to its own devices, could leave the government in the dust, because the economy grew so big, the government couldn't grow that fast. There was no hope for the government to get large in the context of a prodigiously growing economy. The only way the government could get large, at least comparatively, was to develop means of slowing the private economy down. And that it did, fiscal and monetary policy. Hence we have big government. Therefore, the prize which we must keep our eye on today is economic growth. You know, this is really the message I'd like to broadcast to CPAC. I mean, we have to keep our eye on economic growth more than anything else in terms of economic policy. Let every deliberation, every recommendation bend to this goal. Tax policy? Taxes must be low and simple because that is the prerequisite for economic growth. Deficits must become a subordinate issue because if they are not, growth-killing tax increases and tax complexification are the alternative. And as the record shows, deficits will become rounding errors in the context of prodigious economic growth. Utterly trivial. Again, we pay off our debt with growth. Monetary policy? A strong and stable currency, most preferably one backed or at least correlated to gold. It's not as hard as you think. In the great Ronald Reagan boom of the 80s and 90s, gold was basically stable in the private markets at $325 an ounce. The U.S. could have easily adopted convertibility in this period. No one would have noticed it, a policy which obviously would have made impossible the Great Recession, in that episode came from investment bubbles stoked by monetary accommodation. Strong and stable money have never been associated with anything but economic growth, and especially in the context of low taxes. Once a boom really gets going, it would even be practicable to repeal legal tender laws and permit robust currency competition from private currency, in that the dollar would be so strong that it would not have to tremble from that competition. Spending? Well, here we really must remember the great injunction of Alan Reynolds of Supply Side and Cato Institute fame. As Alan Reynolds first told Robert L. Bartley, the great editor of the Wall Street Journal editorial page in the 1970s, what you got to do is cut taxes during recessions and spending during booms. Cut taxes during recessions and cut spending during booms. After a few rounds, you have a nicely shrinking state. I really want to repeat this again because Alan Reynolds first said this in 1975, and he's been saying it to this day. Conservatives, cut taxes during recessions and spending during booms. Do you see what that does? Taxes just go down. All they do is go down, and all spending does is go down. There's just a little phase action. When you have a recession, you cut taxes. Recession solved. When you have a boom, you don't need the spending, cut the spending. And the dynamic at all times is to shrinking government and having a booming economy. Trade and regulation are the other fronts, and again, the criterion must be what results in economic growth. All economics indicates that free trade and spare regulation produces significant increases in useful output, wages, returns, and living standards. Now, some of you will, of course, remember these 5 things: low taxes, strong currency, diminished spending, free trade, spare regulation, as something once called the 5 pillars of Reaganomics. This is the modern conservative political economy. The reason to rededicate ourselves to it today is not simply because it animated the greatest presidency of modern times. That's not only it. The reason we need these 5 principles today is that they result in economic growth. Now, Louis Woodhill, my colleague at Forbes.com, and the great entrepreneur and political rainmaker, recently calculated that if this nation had kept up the rate of growth it had had in the years just before President Nixon took the dollar off gold in 1971, from 1971 to today, 40-some years, we would have increased our cumulative GDP by $80 trillion in those years. $80 trillion is the amount of economic growth that we have forgone cumulatively since we went off gold. If you just look at the old pre-1971 growth trend.
Now that 80 trillion would not only pay off the national debt, but essentially pay off all future liabilities currently envisioned by the government. You know, like you look at the Paul Ryan budget and say, you know, 75 years in the future, we're going to have this $80 trillion. Well, we could have had $80 trillion in cumulative wealth if we just hadn't gone off the gold standard and maintained. So, I mean, economic growth just solves all of these problems. The government can't come up with a financial disaster that cannot be solved by economic growth. And when I say that if we had a $30 trillion economy today, which we would have if we maintained the pre-19 trend of growth, when I say that we could pay off the $15 trillion debt with no diminishment of our current living standards, this really takes 1 year into account. That's right, if we had a $30 trillion economy, we could match our current GDP, which is $15 trillion, pay off the $15 trillion in debt, and then for every future year, keep with the $30 trillion. Double our current living standards all for ourselves. The prodigious effects of economic growth are just something to behold. Now, some conservatives are given to say that part of our problem is a worship of economic growth. This is an acceptable argument if we are talking about preserving an agrarian or traditional society that is highly successful in that mode. The fact, however, in this particular case, that of the United States, is that this country has proven for centuries now that it is the most fabulously successful civilization in the history of the world, chock full of entrepreneurs, doers, and visionaries. We should not be ashamed of bidding for economic growth, and that economic growth is something we demonstrably do very well. Economic growth is perfectly complementary with our talents as Americans. We can only be ourselves if we continue to be borne along with economic growth. And as this odious Great Recession shows, we lose something of ourselves when we get mired in economic sluggishness. Nearly a century ago, and just after the United States completed its aping of the European great powers by adopting a Federal Reserve and an income tax, not to mention the regulation of business, F.A. Hayek realized he had seen enough of the big government state. Future years proved that he had every